In 1787, the Founding Fathers gave us the most perfect form of government devised by man. But what would happen today if we get a new constitutional convention, the first in 1787? Would the results be a blessing, or would it be a nightmare? Let's take a look. This is Beyond the Cover with your host, Gary Benoit, and today we have with us Christian Gomez, who, among other things, is the head of the research department for the John Birch Society. Christian, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Gary.
Okay, well, we're glad to have you, and of course, we're here to talk about this special report that we just put together with the New American Magazine, a special report having to do with an Article 5 convention. And the question that is asked is, will it work? And of course, Christian, you did the cover story, and you deal with that question, but let's start with this. What is an Article 5 convention?
Yeah, well, the Constitution, the fifth article of the Constitution explains how to propose amendments to the Constitution, which the Founding Fathers believed that there would be a need for amendments should there be found to be any defects or errors. And an example of what they meant by a defect or an error, for example, would be the lack of safeguarding our unalienable rights. Because remember, when the Constitutional Convention was convened, the Federal Convention of 1787, as you mentioned, in the city of Philadelphia, they were not even thinking about a Bill of Rights at the time. In fact, that's why we have the Anti-Federalist Papers. It was a collection of writings about why we should not rush to accept the new Constitution until we had our unalienable rights guaranteed and protected through law. Because there were those who believed that we didn't even need a Bill of Rights. But there were those with the foresight, no, we will need a Bill of Rights. And without a Bill of Rights, the Constitution, we shouldn't ratify it unless we get that guarantee. And of course, we did get that guarantee. We got the first 10 amendments to correct the defect of a lack of the protection of the unalienable rights. So the fifth article of the Constitution explains how to propose amendments. And there's essentially two ways that amendments can be proposed to the Constitution. The first method is that 2/3 of both chambers or of both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, if they deem it necessary, they can propose amendments which are then transmitted to the states for final ratification. And the other method is for a convention that is called by Congress when 2/3 of the states apply for it. And that's the second method. And that second method for the proposal of amendments has never been utilized in American history since the Constitution was ratified. All of the 27 amendments that we have currently to the Constitution, all of them came about through acts of Congress, beginning with the first 10, the Bill of Rights.
Well, of course, there are people who want to change the Constitution who are approaching it, they say, from a conservative perspective. That is, they like the Constitution, but they're arguing that the Constitution has been violated, and they want to change it to, for what purpose, Christian? To make it bulletproof? For example, they want to add a balanced budget amendment, or they want to add term limits. How will this solve the problem that we have today, runaway government?
Yeah, I think no one will disagree, even those who want the convention, at least most of those who want the convention. None of us will disagree that we have a problem in Congress with a runaway Congress. But the problem is the so-called solution that's presented to us. So the advocates of a convention say that the convention itself is the solution. They say the Founding Fathers gave us Article 5 for such a time as this. And they twist the words of George Mason from the convention. James Madison took copious notes, and of course we cover that in this particular article, but they twist George Mason's words, because George Mason is the person who can be credited for the convention method in Article 5. Some call him the father of Article 5, or of the Article 5 convention aspect. And what George Mason, just to paraphrase, actually I don't have to paraphrase it, I do have it, the exact quote from George Mason. At the convention, this is from Madison's notes on the debates in the Federal Convention. Colonel Mason thought the plan of amending the Constitution exceptionable and dangerous, as the proposing of amendments is in both the modes to depend in the first immediately, in the second ultimately on Congress. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive, as he verily believed would be the case. George Mason was concerned that only Congress had the ability to propose amendments to the Constitution based off the drafts of Article 5 that have been created up to that point, and that the people would not be able to propose amendments at all if only Congress could propose the amendments in Article 5. So the COS organization, particularly, they take these words out of context. They twist them to make it sound as though Mason was saying that Article 5, that the convention method, was specifically put in there in case the federal government or Congress became a tyrannical, and that because they're so tyrannical, there would be no way to stop the federal government or to rein them in unless the states had the ability to propose amendments on their own. But that's not what George Mason was saying. George Mason was concerned that Congress would not propose the right amendments, so he proposed this convention method, which still depends on Congress, because Congress does have to call the convention, of course, when the application of 2/3 of the states are there. But the convention method does allow the people to propose amendments through their delegates. So Congress is still involved in that, but Congress is not. They're not the ones proposing the text of the amendments like they would be in the first method of amending the Constitution.
Well, of course, the text or the amendments that would be looked at by the delegates at the convention, that would be determined by the delegates themselves, would it not? Because when they open the convention, they would possess the power, and there is a precedent for that, which is the Convention of 1787, which is indicated earlier. That was a very, very good thing. But if we have a convention today, do you see that the delegates assembled for that convention as being on the same level as George Washington or some of the other delegates who are at that convention?
You'd be really hard-pressed to find someone of that same caliber in this day and age. And actually, when you do find people that I would say have the closest worldview to those of the Founding Fathers, most of those individuals, and I would put in names in that category like a Thomas Massey or a Ron Paul.
Right.
Most of the folks who would come closest to the Founding Fathers, they're totally opposed to the idea of even holding a convention as well. So the best people you could probably get as delegates likely wouldn't be the delegates anyway. And at this point, they currently oppose there even being a convention, probably because they know what would really come out of a convention. This is not in the article, but Ron Paul, he was of course, he ran for president 3 times, but the last 2 times in 2008 and 2012, he had delegates he was going to take to the convention, and at the convention, some of those delegates are found not to be considered valid, even though he went through the process of the primaries and the caucuses and won those delegates lawfully according to the rules, and they would not have those delegates seated at the convention and counted towards his count for the presidency, probably because they didn't want to upset the GOP establishment picks of McCain and Romney in those elections. But it goes to show you that even at a convention, even if you think you're sending the right delegates to the convention, ultimately the person who controls the gavel does control the convention. And that's probably one good reason why Ron Paul opposes an Article 5 convention, because he saw what the Republican National Convention was like. And just think about that. The Republican National Convention. It's a convention of all Republicans. That's the criteria to be at the convention.
Sure,
you have to be.
Not all those Republicans are conservative, though.
That's very true.
They may claim to be so, but they're certainly not constitutionalists.
But at least they're all Republicans.
Right.
All right. What kind of delegates would there be at an Article 5 convention? If you listen to the advocates, they make it sound like it's going to be all state legislators, but not just all state legislators, all Republican state legislators, and not just all Republican state legislators, but all conservative Republican state legislators. It's not a conservative conference. It's a federal constitutional convention.
There would be Democrats there as well as Republicans, and liberals as well as conservatives, and internationalists as well as American firsters.
Yeah, there would be a large conglomerate of people from all sorts of viewpoints. And like Barry Goldwater said, and this is in the magazine, but not in my article, we have the quote from Barry Goldwater where he fears that that whatever will come out of the convention, that our republic wouldn't even last.
Right. Now, this issue, again, we describe it as a special report because the entire issue of the magazine, the July 11 issue, is devoted to the subject of an Article 5 convention. But it includes 2 pages of talking points. And you were one of the key people. In fact, you coordinated putting those talking points together. And I think there's, about 17 of them altogether, 17 talking points. But could you mention maybe two or three of those sound bites as to why it'd be a very bad idea today to have a constitutional convention?
Okay, sure. Let's look at the first one. The primary precedent for an Article 5 convention is the 1787 Constitutional Convention. However, the 1787 convention went beyond its original purpose to merely revise the Articles of Confederation, did its work in secret, and changed the ratification rules. This is a frightening precedent for a modern-day convention. So that's exactly true, and we discussed this in both the article I wrote, the cover story, and also the article by Robert Owen's history article, which I recommend that you read that one as well. But like you said earlier, we've never had an Article 5 convention. We've never had any constitutional convention since the last one in Philadelphia. So all we have to go by, essentially, is precedent. So what happened there? That convention was a limited convention. In fact, it was even referred to several times by various people, including George Washington, as being a convention of the states.
Yes.
So the Federal Convention of 1787 was a limited convention of the states. The commissions from the various states, including even that from the Confederation Congress, but the state ones were the more prominent ones, they authorized all the delegates to revise the Articles of Confederation. And of course, this is a copy here of the Articles of Confederation, and that's what they were tasked to do, because the Articles of Confederation were not meeting the task at hand, so to speak. So the delegates, being limited to only revises, there was no commission, there was no authorization telling the delegates going in that you're going to have to eventually scrap this and replace it with a totally new constitution. It wasn't until they were there that they realized that there's no way we can fix this. This is not fixable. We'll need a new one. And the excuse that they used to create a new constitution, the precedent for that was the Declaration of Independence, essentially, the right of the people to alter or abolish their form of government. And one has to understand the nature of what is a convention, which the cover story, my article, deals with, and also Robert Owen's article as well. That's why I recommend his article again. But both articles discuss what is a convention. And essentially, to answer that question, a convention is a body of delegates or deputies that represent the people, and they have the inherent power, because they are the representatives of the people at large. They have the power to frame, revise, and amend constitutions. Right. And that actually is that's a paraphrase also of Black's Law dictionary definition of constitutional convention.
Right. The Article 5 convention is cited as an example of a constitutional convention, and yet COS says this is not a constitutional convention.
Yes, that's exactly correct. So Black's Law Dictionary has faithfully defined and what a constitutional convention is since 1910 as follows: as an assembly of state or national delegates who meet to frame, amend, and revise their constitution.
Right. So no question that what COS is calling for is a constitutional convention, even though they try to avoid that phraseology. And I imagine, Christian, the reason they want to avoid that phraseology is because the whole purpose of a constitutional convention is to change the Constitution. Now, one question I'd like to have an answer to, and I'm sure you would as well, and maybe you could tell me if anyone has ever been able to answer this question to satisfaction, but does it make any sense whatsoever to call a constitutional convention for the purpose of changing the Constitution, if the problem that we're facing today with runaway government and runaway Congress and a runaway presidency and whatnot, if all these violations of the Constitution is not because of the Constitution, but because people are violating their oaths of office to the Constitution, how do we solve the problem by changing the Constitution?
No, that's just exactly right. The problem you identified is not the Constitution. It's a violation of the oath to uphold the Constitution. Right. So changing the Constitution, even if you had a magic wand with magic words and amendments to add to supposedly even improve upon the document, even if you could achieve that, that would still require an educated electorate to uphold it even. So the solution is not to change the Constitution, because by changing the document, you're not going to change the hearts and minds of those who already disobey and depart from its tenor. So the only way to get the American Congress, the elected officials, and the American people themselves to get back to the Constitution is through enforcement and education. And the only way to achieve that is with an educated action program, like the one that the John Birch Society offers. We offer at the John Birch Society the Constitution is a Solution workshop video series, which highly recommend that all those who are watching this video, if you have not seen the Constitution is a Solution workshop series, watch those videos, set up lectures in your neck of the woods, because we can't expect people to vote in constitutionalist if they don't even know what the Constitution says.
Right.
That's a huge problem. I know that you wrote the article about term limits, but let's just briefly talk about that as an example to show the follies of a constitutional convention. So when you look at a place like New York State has 2 U.S. senators like every other state, Kirsten Gillibrand and Schumer, right? Well, Senator Gillibrand, she replaced Hillary Clinton, remember, right? Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton, before she was the senator for New York, she was the first lady in the White House of Bill Clinton. Now, when Senator Moynihan of New York, Patrick Moynihan, when he was going to announce he was going to resign, the Democrats were scrambling to get a big-name person to hopefully run for his seat and win, and they convinced the then still First Lady of the U.S. to run. She did. The Clintons bought the residence there in New York to qualify under New York state law. She won the election, and she was then reelected when, under the presidency of George W. Bush, she was reelected to the U.S. Senate. Well, within a year and a half of her reelection in New York, she stepped down to become Secretary of State under President Obama. So she basically term limited herself. She was only there for a little over one full term. And now, did the voters of New York, when they had the first opportunity to vote someone new after her, did they vote in a constitutionalist? No. They voted for Gillibrand, who was already, of course, appointed by the governor of New York, but they didn't have to keep her. They could have voted her out. They had options. No, they didn't vote her out. They voted to elect her, and they've reelected her numerous times. And her voting record, if you look at our Freedom Index score, her score is actually slightly even worse than Hillary's was. So Hillary was a very slight improvement versus the current U.S. Senator who has that seat, Gillibrand. So that's an example. It's an illustration of how term limits won't work. You can term limit someone bad out, but there's no guarantee that the replacement is any better. Chances are the replacement will be worse. In a congressional district where the voters are not educated in the Constitution, we see the results. Look at a place like again, New York City, good example, the Bronx and Queens, the congressional district that makes up Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She challenged an incumbent establishment Democrat who was no constitutionalist, not even a conservative. She defeated that guy, got his seat. She's far worse than than her predecessor, and that's because there's a lack of education on the Constitution.
Well, unless the voters are informed, they're just going to keep sending back the same old socialists. The name of the socialists may be different, but it's still going to be socialism.
That's why a convention won't work, because you need an educated electorate first before you can even begin. Before you begin trying to tamper with the wording of the Constitution, you shouldn't do that unless you have an educated electorate. And if you did have an educated electorate, you wouldn't want a convention. You wouldn't see a need for one at all, because you would be voting in people. The American people would be educated enough to know to vote in constitutionalists. They would be holding their oaths of office if they're truly constitutionalists. So there would be no need for proposing any amendments of any kind, especially through a convention where it's very unknown as to what would come out of it. If there is any one amendment that you definitely know you want, very specific amendment, then you go through the congressional route. So if we had an educated electorate with a constitutionalist supermajority Congress, that would be the ideal time to, let's say, pass an amendment in the Congress to repeal the 17th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, the two worst amendments of the Constitution. That would be the best ideal circumstance. But to try to do anything like that right now, to add any amendments of any kind without an educated electorate, especially through a convention, you're just asking for disaster, and the likes of people like AOC to likely have more influence than the most conservative members of your state's legislature or of Congress having any influence.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, the whole purpose of the John Birch Society, the parent organization of the New American Magazine, is to wake the town and tell the people and get them involved. And if people do have the understanding needed, this whole thing would turn around, and socialists would either get defeated or they would realize they are no longer electable, and they would change their ways in order to stay in office. So, Christian, thank you very much. Glad to have you on the program, and we encourage everybody to get a copy of this special report. There'll be information regarding that in the description for this video. And in fact, not only get one copy, but we would urge to get multiple copies in order to use this among other tools to create the understanding that's so desperately needed to save our country. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.